Okay? And so we've talked about, I still don't have dry notes from you, I don't think. Hang on a second, I got my notes up. I'm just determined to do the acquired immune system today. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to be talking about primarily the inflammatory process and the things that take place in the inflammatory process. We're also going to be looking at, I don't know why it does that, we're also going to be talking a little bit about the adaptive immune system. So let me just show you this video, which I've already got it up, and hopefully it goes past the, no it didn't. Oh, but this is good. I've not seen this. Notice it does say I can skip ad, but I just can't make myself. Has anybody seen it?
Yeah.
Oh, you've seen it, okay. Oh, it's beef jerky. That is funny. Okay, now back to the class. Cool. Now this is a biology video, but it does a great job of covering. You hear it. It's probably illegal to record it, so I guess let me pause the
Trillions of microbes ready to invade our bodies lurk in the air, the water, the foods we eat, and on the objects we touch. Nevertheless, most of us are healthy most of the time and unaware of the constant battle between body and microbes. Even when infections occur, we almost always fend them off quickly. Our usual state of good health is due to three lines of defense: external barriers that keep microbes out of the body, non-specific internal defenses that combat all invading microbes, and our immune system, which assaults specific microbes.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the external barriers.
The body's first defense against microbes are the skin and the mucous membranes of the digestive and respiratory tracts. The dry, dead cells, filled with hard proteins that cover the outer surface of the skin, prevent most microbes landing on the skin from obtaining needed water and nutrients, while passage of natural antibiotics secreted by the sweat and sebaceous glands actively inhibit the growth of bacteria, fungi on the skin. The membranes of the digestive and respiratory tract are protected by mucus, which contains antibacterial enzymes that destroy the cell walls of bacteria and physically traps microbes that enter the body through the nose or mouth. Cilia on the membranes sweep up the mucus, microbes and all, until it is either coughed up, sneezed, or swallowed. Swallowed microbes enter the stomach, where they encounter a combination of extreme acidity and protein-digesting enzymes that kills many microbes. Farther along the digestive tract, bacteria harmless to humans secrete substances deadly to other invading bacteria or fungi. Though these defenses are good, the warm, moist mucous membranes are more vulnerable to invasion than the skin. Disease organisms that enter the body through the skin or mucous membranes run into three non-specific internal defenses: standing armies of phagocytic and natural killer cells, the inflammatory response, and fever.
I don't know why it has a little bird there. I'll follow us on Twitter, I guess that's what it is. Okay, let me get rid of this. Very serious sounding there. Okay. All right, so we want to talk a little bit about the immunity, and we're going to talk about the first line of defense, which is our innate resistance. Our innate resistance is something that we're born with. It's also called native or natural immunity. Native or natural immunity. And it's supposed to be our first, that when an organism is, it comes into contact with us, the first place it's going to come in contact with is our innate resistance. If the NATE can't handle it, then our second line of the defense, which we're going to talk about a lot today, is going to be the inflammatory process. And then if that's breached, or if the inflammatory process is not able to do what it needs to do, then what's going to happen is the adaptive immune system is going to lend a hand. So we're going to talk about the adaptive and finish up the inflammatory next week. So when we're looking at our first line of defense, what do we have? We have the physical barriers, which that of course is our epithelial cells, which is the skin. And that's going to be one of our biggest barriers. And it has some natural mechanisms in place. It has the ability to slough off. And what I mean slough off is when skin cells, they can actually fall away. You lose those skin cells and they're replaced by new ones. So that's what I mean by sloughing off. In the linings of the gastrointestinal and genitourinary and respiratory tract, we can also slough off, but there's some other things that we can also see. In the respiratory tract, if we have something that comes in, then we have coughing and sneezing takes place, and that's where the cilia and the goblet cells that I mentioned in one of our earlier lectures are very, very useful because they will trap it, encase it in that mucus, and then the cilia moves it back up so that you can cough it out. Flushing can be seen with tears. That would be a great example. So flushing would be tears. And of course, vomiting and diarrhea, just when something's inside the stomach recognizes it's not supposed to be there or it's not helpful to you, it's going to try to get rid of it. And then I've already mentioned the mucus and cilia for the respiratory. You also have in the genitourinary system, you have the ability to produce some mucus there as well, which will help move things out through the genitourinary system. Also, of course, urinating and flushing things out will get rid of it. And there's also the urine has a tendency to be normally a little acidic, which does not promote growth in normal situations. And then we have some biochemical barriers, and this is where we actually have some enzymes. All that means we have enzymes in specific places that also help to attack and break down and prevent us from being infected with these things. And so I've listed those there. Saliva has enzymes. You also have it in earwax. Most people don't realize that earwax does provide us some benefits other than just being a pain. Sweat, and then I've already mentioned mucus, and these are basically just little peptide enzymes that can help. One of the things I wanted to mention was something called normal bacterial flora. And that is, we have organisms that are normally growing inside of us, and they live perfectly in homeostasis. They're a lot of times they don't provide any benefits or any problems as long as homeostasis is maintained. There are some that are actually beneficial and aid in things such as digestion and the GI tract. So we do have bacteria that is living inside of us and is perfectly fine, doesn't cause any problems until homeostasis. We get out of homeostasis. And then what's going to happen is that bacteria can take the opportunity to cause some problems. It can cause a secondary infection. And when that happens, it becomes what we call an opportunistic organism. An opportunistic organism, which means it takes the opportunity to cause a problem, a disease. The best example would be when you take antibiotics. If you take antibiotics too long, or maybe you have to take a couple rounds of antibiotics because you've been really sick and the first one didn't do it, those antibiotics will actually destroy that balance, that normal flora balance, and can cause some secondary infections. One of them is yeast. You can actually have an overgrowth of yeast and end up with yeast infections. And then more seriously, Clostridium difficile is normally in your stomach and is fine and doesn't cause any problems. But if given the opportunity, it actually can cause a really horrible diarrhea, cause individuals, particularly the very young and the very old, to get dehydrated. And if we don't get it corrected, it can cause death. So we have to be very careful with that. So that's what can happen if your normal bacteria gets out of kilter. All right, so the second line of defense is the inflammatory response, and the inflammatory response will generally come into play when the native or natural immune system has been breached. It can't handle whatever is going on. When we see the inflammatory process get started, and I've already mentioned the inflammation several times, some of the things that we've already talked about, but some of the things that can cause the inflammatory process to start is an infectious process. And the inflammatory process is the way that we can actually try to address the infection and hopefully beat it back down and get rid of it. Mechanical damage, that'd be trauma. Anytime type of trauma. If you fall down and get a scrape or a cut, you're going to see the signs of inflammation develop. Ischemia, we've already talked about ischemia as lack of blood flow. So the oxygen is insufficient. The oxygen and nutrients are insufficient for the area. Nutrient deprivation. So if you have somebody that's malnourished, not getting enough nutrients to the area. Temperature extremes, so very hot, very cold, that's going to cause cellular damage. We've already talked about. That's going to start the inflammatory process. Burns, I've already mentioned those several times. That's a huge inflammatory process. That's why we have such a major shift in fluid, because the inflammatory process is going on. Exposure to radiation, it can be thermal, it can be any type of radiation that we talked about. One of the things that I want to talk to you about is the difference between local versus systemic. When we look at the signs and symptoms of inflammation, it's really important that you differentiate between the two. And so local means in a specific area. It is localized to that site. Whereas systemic means body-wide. Generally, those are more generalized symptoms. A lot of times they're more vague, such as fever. Well, fever doesn't tell you where the problem is. It just tells you that there is a problem. So that would be a great example of systemic. And then we're going to talk later on about acute versus chronic inflammation. Acute usually lasts less than 3 months, and then chronic is greater than that. And it's generally unresolved in an inflammatory process. Okay, so what are the goals of inflammation? The goals of inflammation are one, it has to have its own braking system. So you look at this person and go, wait a minute, why would you want to limit it? Well, the inflammatory process in itself can be damaging to the body, and so it has to have its own braking system to say, okay, that's enough, we need to stop. We have some disease processes where the inflammatory process doesn't pay attention to those breaks, and we have some damage that occurs. We'll talk about it later on. Prevent and limit infection. So it recognizes that an infectious process is taking place. Your natural or innate system wasn't able to stop it, and so it wants to prevent it from getting any worse, prevent it from spreading, preventing from further damage from occurring. And then if it needs to, depending on what we're seeing, it will help initiate the adaptive immune response. And then the very first step in healing actually is the inflammatory process. So it initiates healing. And this just shows you the difference between local versus systemic. We won't get into them too much, but I will, under local, we will talk quite a bit about the vascular stage versus the cellular stage. The white blood cell response, that's a more systemic response. That'd be your white blood cell count will be elevated. But that still doesn't tell you specifically where the problem is. It just tells you there is a problem going on. And then fever is another one in terms of the acute phase response. Okay, let's see if this one works. It would be my lucky day. Now, okay, this video is actually, this individual has stolen this video, so I guess maybe Michelle, it's actually from a textbook, so he or she added rap music at the beginning of it, so just bear with me, because it's a great video to show you the inflammatory response. It actually shows you every step in there, so.
Inflammation is the protection.
Isn't that the funniest transition ever?
Acute inflammation is the early, almost immediate reaction of tissue to the injury, and it is the first phase of wound healing. Acute inflammation can be triggered by cell or tissue damage, or by the presence of dead cells or noxious agents, such as bacteria. Acute inflammation typically occurs before the immune response and aims primarily at removing the injury-causing agent and limiting the extent of tissue damage. Acute inflammation occurs in two overlapping stages, vascular and cellular. In the vascular stage, arterioles and venules near the site of injury constrict briefly, then dilate. Dilation promotes congestion, while an accompanying increase in capillary permeability leads to the movement of fluid into the affected tissue, resulting in the 5 classic signs of inflammation: redness, swelling, heat, pain, and loss of function. As fluid leaves the capillaries, the blood remaining in circulation becomes more viscous. It flows more slowly, and clotting occurs. cellular stage of acute inflammation is initiated by the movement of phagocytic white blood cells, or leukocytes, into the area of injury. The leukocytes begin to adhere to the vessel wall, and then, in a process called emigration, squeeze through the wall and move into the inflamed tissue. The leukocytes wander through the tissue, guided by chemical signals in a process called chemotaxis. The cellular stage culminates in the leukocytes engulfing and degrading the bacteria and cellular debris in a process called phagocytosis. Products of phagocytosis, along with plasma and blood cells, form exudates, which accumulate, causing swelling and pain. Exudates are composed of serous fluid, red blood cells, fibrinogen, or tissue debris, and white blood cell breakdown products. Concurrent with the events of the vascular and cellular stages, chemical mediators release bioactive agents that act to mediate the inflammatory response. Mediators are derived from the cells or from plasma. One of the first mediators of an inflammatory response is a cell-derived mediator, histamine, found in high concentrations in the mast cells of connective tissues adjacent to blood vessels, as well as in blood basophils and platelets. Histamine is released in response to a variety of stimuli and causes dilation and increased permeability of capillaries. Serotonin, another cell-derived mediator, performs similar actions. The three major plasma-derived mediators are present in the plasma in precursor forms that must be activated, usually by a series of proteolytic enzymes. The kinins increase capillary permeability and stimulate pain receptors. The clotting system traps exudates, microorganisms, and foreign bodies. The complement cascade causes vasodilation, promotes leukocyte chemotaxis, and augments phagocytosis. Acute inflammation comprises a variety of complex protective responses to injury that together lay the groundwork for the next stages of the body's recovery: immune response and tissue repair.
Okay, so again, a great video to show you that takes you right through the stages of, I guess I'll pull it on. Let's see. Sorry, I just locked it up. There it is. That's the problem with bouncing back and forth between everything. It locks things up. Okay, what is involved in the inflammatory process? Cell receptors, which you mentioned a little bit, plasma protein systems. We're going to talk about cytokines and chemokines, endothelium, which is the lining of, particularly we're going to talk lining of skin, lining of the vessel wall, and then we're going to look at the specific cells that are going to be associated with it. The receptors that I mentioned, there are certain receptors in the body that are specific to recognizing when something is abnormal and coming into the body or is present in the body. And so we have pathogen-associated molecular patterns, and we also have damage-associated molecular patterns. The pathogens looking for specific pathogen recognition molecules, and then the damage-associated is looking for the byproducts of that. It also be looking for toxins that those bacteria or organisms are producing, because they will actually, some of these organisms can produce toxins that are more damaging to the body than actually having them in the body. And then toll-like receptors, we won't worry about those too much, and then we're going to talk about the complement receptors. Complement is really important in doing what's called opsonization, which basically means that it helps, it recognizes, using these receptors, it recognizes that there's something more in the body, it will tag that, and that's a process that gets really complicated, but it really will tag it for destruction. So basically it marks it for death, is what it does. And then it'll help promote cleaning up all the byproducts of the war that went on. Okay, so the plasma protein systems that are involved, we have the complement system, which I just mentioned, what is involved in opsonization, the tagging, and promoting destruction of organisms. The clotting system, which blood clots are actually very beneficial in terms of trapping organisms, limiting it to the site so that it can't spread and go other places. And then the kinase system is important in, it's a vasodilator, it stimulates the production of some chemicals that will promote the complement system and other cells coming to the area. So it's sort of a communicating system. Also helps you with pain. And this is a video for the complement system. It's not a video. I think I may have showed you this before I did, or maybe it was last semester, I don't know. McGraw-Hill has this great source, and it's free. You just get on there and you can watch wherever you want to. And so all you do is go pick the topic that you want to look at, and they have these little videos. So this shows you the complement system.
Complement consists of a group of serum proteins that activates inflammation, destroys cells, and participates in opsonization. Complement can be activated by a number of different foreign molecules. The complement proteins respond in a sequential manner, producing a cascade of reactions. The major components are C1 through C9, named in the order that they were discovered, not in the order in which they function. The complement cascade can be activated by the classical pathway or by the alternative pathway. In the classical pathway, C1 becomes activated when it binds to an antigen-antibody complex.
And you don't have to worry about the C1,
activated
C2, we're not going to do
then
that.
cleaves C2 into C2A and C2B, and C4 into C4A and C4B.
See, we don't have to worry about that.
C2B and C4B combine to form a protease called C3 convertase. C3 convertase then cleaves C3 into C3A and C3B. In the alternative
I'm like, what? I found out
antigens
now.
such as endotoxin, polysaccharides, or cell wall components react with C3b. Small amounts of C3a and C3b are constantly being formed from C3, but without activation, they are soon destroyed. C3b reacts with the proteins factor B, factor D, and properidin to form a complex called C3 convertase, which cleaves C3 into C3a and C3b. Both of these pathways of complement activation follow the same sequence after cleavage of C3.
Okay, so after cleavage, then you want to
C3a is involved in stimulating inflammation. C3b reacts with other complement components to form C3 convertase, which forms more C3a and C3b. C3b also attaches to the surfaces of microorganisms.
And so this is the important part. It stimulates inflammation, and then it also plays a role in opsonization. So,
Phagocytes have a binding site for C3b. Therefore, microorganisms with C3b bound to their surfaces are more susceptible to phagocytosis. Coating of bacteria to make them more susceptible to phagocytosis is called opsonization. Addition of properidin to C3 convertase results in formation of C5 convertase, which cleaves C5 into C5a and C5b. C5a enhances inflammation and acts as a chemoattractant for phagocytes. C5b reacts with other complement components, including C6, C7, C8, and C9, to form a membrane attack complex. This structure forms a hole in the cell membrane and causes cells to lyse.
all right, so that shows you overall. Again, don't get caught up in the A, B, C, and whatever. But it shows you overall what you can see in the complement system, so you can use that again to help you study. Let's see if it's the right one. Yes, okay. Okay, so we also want to look at the cytokines that are involved. There are cytokines, which are chemicals that are chemical mediators, basically is what cytokines are. There is the interleukins, the tumor necrosis factor, and interferons. And we won't just know that these are chemical mediators. The interleukins, we will see that a little bit again when we do temperature. The presence of interleukins actually causes fever, so we'll see that associated with those. And then the tumor necrosis factor, that's very significant because we do recognize that high levels of the tumor necrosis factor, which tells us there's something really serious going on in terms of inflammation, has been associated with mortality. So high levels of the tumor necrosis factor have been associated. It's actually, you'll see them the wasting syndrome, they'll start wasting away, and then mortality can ensue. we have to get that under control. And then I'll show you a picture. There's a lot of them, so there's a reason we won't get too in-depth in those because there is so many of them. So I'll only mention a couple. And then the chemokines actually make a chemical gradient. And what they do is that chemical gradient attracts and signals other things to come to the area. That's what a chemokine does. All right, so the interleukins I mentioned, they're produced primarily by macrophages and lymphocytes in response to a pathogen or stimulation of the byproducts of other products of the inflammatory process. You may have the interleukin formed as a result of that. There are a lot of those. There are two that I will mention here. Interleukin 1, I wanted just to give you a definition. It is pro-inflammatory. Pro means that it is for the inflammatory process. So it's pro-inflammatory, so it actually keeps the inflammatory process going. Whereas interleukin 10 is anti-inflammatory, so meaning it puts the brakes on the inflammatory process. So remember, we all have to have a system of checks and balances. And again, I've got a picture that'll show you how many of these things there actually are. So pro-inflammatory, pro means you're for it, anti means you're against it. Your interferons, I-N-F-E-R-S, interferon is actually something you give to the patient. I-N-F-E-R-O-N, I have to know a little of that, we come up with that. Protects against viral infections, but specific to viral infections. And what happens with a virus is different. Bacteria can actually live independently in the body and multiply and be, happy to take over if they want to. Viruses have to actually get inside the host cell, gets into the DNA and is part of the replication process. It literally becomes part of the cell's makeup. That's what a virus does. We finally have to destroy that cell to get rid of it. And so it's a little bit different. So interferon will be produced when you have viruses present. And it gives you a couple types here. Again, we won't go over those, but just to give you an idea, alpha and beta induce production of antiviral proteins. So hopefully we're going to do something to stimulate inflammation and get rid of those. But one thing I do need to tell you is it's harder for the body to recognize viruses because they're actually part of your own cell. When you're out as a bacteria, it's easier to recognize. Viruses are harder because you're actually inside and become part of the makeup of the cell. They will start to shed some little pieces of viruses, and the body can pick those up and recognize those, but it is more difficult. And then gamma interferon increases biocidal, which means to kill, activity of the macrophages. So it's going to actually stimulate the macrophages to be more active and hopefully can address this and get a hold of this virus. This just shows you how the interferons work, and so this is in your textbook. You can take a look at that. It shows you this is actually a cell that has been infected with a virus. It's going to produce interferon in response to that, and it binds with an uninfected cell, and then the protein blocks the viral, hopefully the virus from getting into that cell. So it recognizes that in the infected cell, it produces the interferon, which is then going to go and coat, in effect, or bind to the receptors of other cells, so that hopefully they can't get infected. So that's the body's way to try to address that. The tumor necrosis factor is secreted by the macrophages, and it's in response to the pattern-associated molecular receptors that I talked about, the toll-like receptors. They have recognized that there's a problem. And so when you have the tumor necrosis factor, it will cause fever. All right, and the fever is caused by endogenous pyrogen. So when you have the tumor necrosis factor stimulated, we're actually producing our own pyrogens to try to address, and we'll talk later on about why fever is so beneficial. So endogenous means our own, we're producing those. Exogenous would be something outside the body or has come inside the body, it's not normally there, that's producing it. It increases synthesis of inflammatory serum proteins that we'll go over in a little bit, and I've already mentioned it causes the muscle wasting. It can also cause intravascular, so within the vessel thrombosis, that means blood clots. So a lot of blood clots to form, which is very serious. And like I said, mortality rate is, the higher this level is, the higher the mortality rate is. All right, this is to show you, here's all the things that are involved, and so that's a lot. We don't do all those. There's a lot more of the interleukins that are listed here. I just mentioned those two. Okay, so we just need to want to review, and I know I did a little of this in Chapter 1, a little bit, just very briefly, about the cells involved in the inflammatory process. We divide those by granulocytes versus agranulocytes. Granulocytes mean that they contain granules, little bags of granules within them. Those granules are very important because they can actually be involved in they stimulate some processes that can cause destruction from organisms. And then we have agranulocytes, A meaning without, so these are cells that do not have granules in them. And so the first one is our neutrophils. Our neutrophils, I call those our first responders in the inflammatory process. They are the 911. When you have an injury or some sort of bacteria, whatever it is, occur, the first thing that's going to be stimulated by that is going to be attracting the neutrophils to that area. Now, the neutrophils are very short-lived. They do a couple things in this process. They will stimulate other components of the inflammatory process to take place. They have some mild phagocytic properties, but they only last for a few hours. They don't last long. So once they come to the site, they're going to start the process, and they're going to start dying off. And so they are the first responders. They get the process going. And then we have the eosinophils. The eosinophils will come later in the process, so they come afterwards to help out after the neutrophils are starting to go away. They also have granules, and the granules are particularly, and the eosinophils are particularly good for parasites. We use those granules for that purpose. They have some phagocytic properties as well. The basophils are sort of an unknown entity. We really don't know a whole lot about basophils. They think that the basophils work very similar to the neutrophils. The basophils are actually circulating in the blood, and so whereas the neutrophils a lot of times are in the tissue, stimulating them, they'll come to the site. And then mast cells. Mast cells are located in tissue, and it's going to be tissue where something coming in and breaching the innate system will come in contact with it quickly. So mucous membranes and skin, layers of vessels, connective tissue is where you're going to find mast cells. Mast cells are extremely important in this process because what's going to happen is you're going to have some sort of injury, and that's going to stimulate the mast cells, and the mast cells are going to degranulate. They're going to release their granules, and that starts this whole cascade effect in the inflammatory process. So they're very, very important in the inflammatory process. Agranulocytes, we have monocytes, and then lymphocytes that we'll mention later on when we do chronic inflammation. When you have chronic inflammation, you're going to see more of these cells because they're more long-term in terms of addressing the inflammatory process. All right, there are also some mediators of the inflammatory process that we need to talk about. One of the most important one is histamine. Histamine is what is released by the mast cells. When the mast cells degranulate, histamine is released. Histamine is a vasodilator, and it increases permeability. The vasodilator and increases permeability. Those are different. All right, vasodilator means the vessel gets, the circumference of the vessel gets wider, it gets bigger so that it can hold more stuff in. Whereas permeability means the cells in the cell wall, the cells in the vessel or tissue, it's the vessel we're talking about, the vessel wall actually start to move apart. And when they move apart, they make those channels that we've talked about where things move back and forth. Those channels get bigger, allowing more things to get out and get to the site of injury. That's the purpose of increased permeability, is to allow all the benefits that we need to get to that site of injury. All right, prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are really important in pain. That'll be the most important thing that we talk about. Kinins as well. They help stimulate the knowledge that you have pain. Serotonin we'll just talk a little bit about, but leukotrienes, I want to mention them because they act very similar to histamine, except they come later in the process and they last longer. All right, so histamine comes first when those mast cells are degranulated in this inflammatory process, and then later on we're going to have the leukotrienes come in. They do the exact same thing. They're a vasodilator and they increase permeability, but they come later and they last longer. And that's going to be really significant when we talk about anaphylaxis. Okay, because anaphylaxis is started by the histamine, but it is the leukotrienes that keep it going and make it life-threatening. And then nitric oxide, it's in the vessel wall. It's already there. nitric oxide is already in the vessel wall, it's always acting, it actually helps us control the tone of our vessel wall, so that sometimes it, if it needs to be constricted or dilated. And so nitric oxide it's a very potent vasodilator. And so we need the vessel to get bigger, then that's going to be stimulated in terms of production. All right, mast cells, I got ahead of myself. Mast cells, I already mentioned, I forgot, that was just overview slide. Cellular bags of granules located in lymph-connected tissues close to the blood vessels. And so that when you're injured, that blood vessel injury is going to stimulate the release of those mast cells. The mast cells are then going to degranulate, and they're going to release histamine. All right, what activates this? Well, physical injury I mentioned, but it also can be chemical agents. It can be an immune process, such as being infected with something. It can be an allergic process, we'll talk about a little later on. And it could be those toll-lock receptors that recognize that something is foreign there and shouldn't be there and needs to be addressed. There are two ways. I mentioned the degranulation. Degranulation means the cell releases that bag of granules. Those granules are released and that histamine comes out. Once that happens, there's also going to be synthesis because you're going to need more of it if it's a significant injury. So then the mast cell will start to synthesize more of that product. So, and some other things that it does synthesize of that slide to show you. Chemotactic factors that are that actually are produced by this, because you want this process to continue. So the mast cells will start the process, they release their the granules and start the process. They'll also synthesize more histamine. They also synthesize neutrophils, chemotactic factor. Chemotactic means that it attracts it to the area, so it's attracting neutrophils. Now the neutrophils are first responders, know to come to the site of inflammation. And then we also have the eosinophils. They come later in the process, but they will come, and they'll be attracted when this stuff is released. It's like pheromones. It attracts them to the area. Okay. Histamine, I've already mentioned, is that is released in the mast cells. Now, this is really confusing a lot of times. It is a potent vasodilator, but what will happen, it depends on which side that you're looking at. It's a vasoactive amine that causes temporary, and this all occurs so fast you can't even imagine it. So you just have to memorize the process. Temporary rapid constriction of the large blood vessels, but it also causes, at the site of injury, dilation of the postcapillary venules. The reason it does that is it allows things to pool in that area, because you really don't want all these factors to be released and then just go right by. And so what it's going to do is it's going to cause things to pool and stay in that area a little bit longer so that they can do the job they need to do. It causes retraction of those endothelial cells that I mentioned. That allows for increased permeability. And histamine, the receptors that are associated with histamine are the H1 receptors, which are pro-inflammatory, and H2 receptors, which are anti-inflammatory. And we'll talk a little bit more about those because H1 is really important, particularly in your nose when you have an allergic reaction and some of the symptoms that you have associated with that. H2 is found in the stomach, and that's your gastric acid secretion. So we'll add those in a little bit later on. Okay, leukotrienes. Leukotrienes are synthesized from the mast cell, and they have similar effects I've already mentioned to histamine. They do come later in the process and last longer, which will cause us some major problems when we get to anaphylaxis, major allergic reactions. Prostaglandins are similar to the leukotrienes, but they also induce pain, I mentioned. And in the platelet activating factor, I told you that clotting is very important in the inflammatory process because you want to limit whatever's happening to that area. And so we've got to get the platelets stimulated so that we can start clotting. And clotting, of course, limits what's going on, prevents things from spreading to other parts of the area, but it also starts to promote healing. So it will start that process as well. And this is the picture that I was talking about. I believe this is in your textbook. This shows you the mast cell and the two things that it's doing. It'll degranulate, and when it degranulates, it does two things. It releases those histamine granules that are already present in the cytosol, and then it also releases those chemotactic factors so that the neutrophils and the eosinophils are going to be attracted to the area. And then at the same time, we're running more of it, so it's going to synthesize some things, and you can skip all the way down here to it's the platelet activating factor, the prostaglandins, and the leukotrienes. Skip the stages in between. Oops, I'm making a noise again. Maybe that'll be better. All right, and this is an overall, shows you the big picture in terms of we do have plasma-derived mediators and we have cell-derived mediators. Plasma is in the bloodstream. cells that are being formed there. And so this just breaks it all down front for you. Your acute phase proteins we've mentioned, we looked at the interferons and the interleukins, the fever, and also produces inflammation. We talked about the complement system, and then this just shows you the mast cells that I talked about. It gives you a concept map, basically, of the things that we just talked about. Okay, one thing I will test you on is the stages so that you understand the signs and symptoms that you see. The real important thing is that you understand why you're seeing the signs and symptoms that you are. And so it is divided between a vascular stage and a cellular stage. And I said that backwards. The cellular stage, no, I didn't. Vascular stage, I'm glad it's Friday. That's all I have to say. I like having a holiday, but it seems like the rest of the week is just completely, I don't know, what happened. Okay, it's divided into two stages, the vascular stage and the cellular stage. The vascular stage comes first. We've got to get all the players in the area first, and once they get there, then the cellular stage begins. The vascular stage, when we're attracting things there, and then the cellular stage will begin. So the vascular stage, what's going to happen is you're going to have stimulation in of course, the mast cells are in the endothelial cells. So when there's some sort of trauma or inflammatory process, the mast cells are going to be stimulated. And so the mast cells are going to release histamine and do all those other things that we talked about. You're also going to have the prostaglandins and the leukotrienes that come a little bit later. And so the result of this vascular stage, when histamine is released, when it touches that area, what you're going to have is increasing blood flow to the injured area. And when you have increasing blood flow, more blood flow in the area, because blood flow is warm and of course it's red blood cells and it's flooding the area, that's going to give you the signs and symptoms of inflammation of redness and warmth. Okay, because I will expect you to know, why do you see redness and warmth and inflammation? So there's your explanation as to why you have redness and warmth. The capillaries become more permeable because those cells are spreading apart, and so it's allowing the leakage of fluid out into the tissues. That fluid is not normally there, so you're going to have swelling, and it's going to be pressing on tissues and nerves, and so you're going to have pain. Okay, so redness, warmth, swelling, and pain. Those are four of the symptoms that you can have in the inflammatory process. And there's the explanation of why those develop. There's one other it talked about in the video, and it does mention it in your textbook, and that is limited mobility. Anytime anything hurts or is swollen, you're not going to want to move it. So it does limit your mobility in that area, depending on if I twist my ankle and that's an inflammatory process, it's going to be swollen, it's going to be warm, it's going to be red, it's going to be extremely painful. I'm not going to want to move it. And it's going to be difficult to move because of the swelling. So the vascular stage, that's when the mast cells degranulate, and it's going to track things to that area. And they haven't gotten there yet, but it's sending out those signals that I want you to come. I want the neutrophils to come here. That's the vascular stage. At the same time, we're going to have dilation take place and permeability, increased permeability take place. That's going to give you the first signs of inflammation. Questions about that? All right, I've already mentioned the kinins. Also, in this, as things are traveling in the plasma, and chemotaxis, which again is the attractant of things along a chemical gradient, that's what chemotaxis is. So you've got the kinins, which act very similar to what we talked about with the mast cells, but also are involved in pain. Coagulation, and so we're attracting the elements to start the clot formation. The complement system that I mentioned, and then C-reactive protein, I'm just going to mention very briefly. This is a protein that we now recognize is present in the body when there is an inflammatory process. We're still learning about C-reactive protein. We don't completely understand it, but what we do know is that we can draw a blood level, and it is elevated, that identifies an inflammatory process is going on. Now, it is not specific, so it doesn't tell me that there's an inflammatory process in the knees or an inflammatory process wherever it is. It just simply tells me that something is going on. So one of the things that we're doing now, particularly for heart disease, because we recognize that atherosclerosis is an inflammatory process, is we're doing one of these blood levels. And if it's elevated, then we look at the risk factors and see, do we need to work this patient up for heart disease? Now, one of the things that I need to let you know is that being overweight, obesity, is actually considered now, we recognize that it is an inflammatory process and causes chronic diseases to develop. And so C-reactive protein will be elevated in individuals who are overweight. And so it will give you a false positive, and so it's hard to, you can't use it at that point. You have to look at other things. looking at heart disease. Questions about that? And that's about all we'll do with C-reactive protein this semester. Okay, so what are the goals of, now that was the vascular stage of inflammation, first of all, stage. Once the cells are being attracted to the area, just to be clear cut, easiest to remember, once the cells get to the area of injury or inflammation, then the cellular phase begins. That's our cutoff right there. When the cells arrive, that is when the cellular stage begins. So what are the goals of the cellular stage of inflammation? You want to get rid of whatever infection. You want to limit the spread of infection. You want to remove the damaged cells, the debris from this battle that's been going on. And as we need to, we're going to release more inflammatory mediators to continue the inflammatory process if we need help. We're not, it's still going on. We haven't quite got it under control. And it also promotes healing. All right, so again, what are the cells that are involved? I've already mentioned all of these on here. I have not mentioned the natural killer cells. Natural killer cells we'll see more in terms of, cancer cells, some viruses. Monocytes mature into macrophages, so monocytes are the immature form, and then they become these big cells that are great for devouring things. And then there's also some that are non-leukocytes, they're non-white blood cells, and that's your platelets. I've already mentioned how they're involved in the clotting process. All right, let's see if this works. This is a lucky day. I probably just, oh, it did. Okay. This tells you about phagocytosis.
In phagocytosis, phagocytes are attracted to the area of invasion by chemical products of the microorganism, phospholipids released by injured mammalian cells, or by components of the complement system. The phagocyte moves into the area of invasion and then attaches to the microorganism. The attachment is mediated by a variety of surface receptors, including antibody, lipopolysaccharide, and complement receptors. For example, the C3b component of complement coats bacteria or other particles and then binds to C3b receptors on the phagocyte. This process of coating to enhance phagocytosis is called opsonization. The microorganism is then engulfed by the phagocyte into a vacuole known as a phagosome. Vesicles in the cytoplasm called lysosomes fuse with the phagosome, releasing digestive enzymes such as lysozyme and proteases into the phagosome. The structure resulting from this fusion is called a phagolysosome. Inside the phagolysosome, microorganisms are killed and digested. Finally, the digested contents of the phagolysosome are eliminated from the phagocyte by exocytosis.
Okay, so another good resource for you, particularly if you need to review some of these processes. Okay. All right, neutrophils we've already mentioned, so this is a little bit of a duplication here, but just bringing it back for now that the cells have arrived. They're also referred to as polymorphonuclear, meaning they have multiple shaped nucleuses. That's what that means, neutrophils. They come really early. They are 911. I've told you that they have some mild phagocytic properties, so they can ingest bacteria, dead cells, and clean out that cellular debris. But the problem is they don't live very long. They die off, and so they have to be replaced by the eosinophils. And so when they die off, they're there in that area, so they're actually going to become part of that exudate. Eosinophils also phagocytic. I can't say it. I just want to really. Okay, I can't wait. I'm sleeping in more. Phagocytic. I've already told you the granules that are inside the eosinophils are very good for parasites. So that's why you see. In fact, one of the things that we do is we'll look at blood counts and we'll look at what cells are we seeing. And if we see eosinophils, a higher level of eosinophil, we start thinking that maybe they've got parasites, because that's when you're going to see a higher level of those. Monocytes and macrophages. Monocytes are produced in the bone marrow. They're immature. They have to mature into the macrophages, and they go actually to the site of inflammation where they're needed, and then they will mature. It usually takes about 24 hours for them to get there, though. So the neutrophils are first, and then these will come later. And this is just a picture to show you how big it gets, and it has, you can see the granule sac in there, so it's an activated macrophage waiting to devour something, and that's in your textbook. Your natural killer cells function to recognize and eliminate some cells that are infected with viruses, some viruses, and also in cancer cells. So we'll see natural killer cells become active in those situations, and then platelets I've already mentioned several times, so you can read that over. Okay, the cells arrive, and so we've already talked about the complement system. It's still involved because we want phagocytosis to occur. Remember, the complement system is involved in opsonization. It initially will track things there, and then once they get to that area, then it's actually going to start doing the opsonization and the phagocytosis, and the clotting system we've covered pretty much. So let's look at those. Okay, so phagocytosis, one thing I wanted to mention is that there are some stages to phagocytosis, so you want to make sure that you review that. We just looked at that video, and it told you that phagocytosis is the process of a cell ingesting and getting rid of foreign material, byproducts of the infection, whatever it is. There are some changes that will take place to allow the cell to be phagocytic. There's some things, first of all, chemotaxis will occur. Chemotaxis, again, means the attraction of a cell to an area. It makes this chemical gradient, and it attracts it to the area. Once these cells get to an area, though, you don't want them to keep going by, and so there'll be some changes that take place on the cell wall that allow it to adhere to the area of injury. So it's going to adhere to that area. And then the most interesting thing takes place. It's called margination or pavementing. And basically what happens is you'll see those leukocytes, they will literally line up along the vessel wall. And it'll look like a cobblestone pathway, really. So it's really fascinating how they just line up and get ready to do the job. They line up along that vessel wall, and the next thing that takes place is they're going to have those pseudopods, which are those they're called false pseudopods and false feet. And so what will happen is this is your increased permeability that has taken place. You've got bigger holes. I don't know how to do that better. What will happen is that the cells will form these little pseudopods that will reach through those holes that have been formed by the increased permeability and grab a hold to the other side of the wall. Once they grab a hold to the side of the wall, they're going to pull themselves through to the other side to get to that side of injury. So that's what immigration is. Immigration is when they actually reach through, grab a hold, and pull themselves to the other side and move to that side of injury. And once they get there, they can do their job, which is going to be phagocytosis. And this, I think I may have borrowed this from a different textbook. So if you don't have this in textbook, let me know. We can get this posted for you. I think I may have left it in the PowerPoints. Did I? I think I left most of the pictures in this time. All right, and so this just shows you what is happening in the arterial, the capillary, and the venal side. So again, very important. This shows you the process of these cells moving through. When you have the increased permeability, it's showing you the holes that have developed here. This is showing you you're going to have red blood cells because you're going to bleed when you get hurt. So that when you have increased permeability, the red blood cells are going out. The white blood cells are going out. This is the neutrophils going out to the other side. Here are where the plates are aggregating, and they're going to get ready to form a blood clot. So this shows you all the things that are going on, all the changes that are taking place. All right, so what's going to happen? Well, now the white blood cell has gotten to that area. What's going to happen then? Well, one of the things that has to happen is that it has to find that foreign substance, find that foreign agent, and attach to it. So what it's going to do is it's going to adhere to whatever that foreign. Remember, they've been tagged. They've already been coated and tagged in opsonization, and that helps this process because once they're tagged like that, then this phagocytosis the cell will go straight to it, and it will hook up with it because it's already been tagged and made sticky, I guess, would be one of the best ways to put it. So it'll adhere to it. And then what's going to happen is it's going to engulf it. So it's going to engulf it, and it's going to form a phagosome, which is just an encapsulated area in there where it's engulfed it. And then we're going to have those granules come out. Remember, we're talking granulocytes. So the granules will come out, and the job of the granule is to break down whatever foreign substance that we're talking about. So it's going to destroy it. So those are the steps to phagocytosis. Questions? All right. No questions on vascular stage, cellular stage, phagocytosis, how that takes place? Okay. All right. So let's look. I've already mentioned the local manifestations of inflammation. The when you get injured, the signs that you see are the result of all these chemical mediators and these reactions that we're seeing that are taking place on the arterial side and the venial side. And so what we have are, as we saw in the video, we have heat, redness, swelling, and pain. And so the heat is caused by what?
The dilation of the vessels and the blood rushing to it.
Right, it's dilating, and the increased permeability is allowing the blood rush to that area. It's cooling in that area because of those changes, and so that is going to make the heat. What about the redness? Same thing. Swelling. Now, it's not just red blood cells; it's also plasma. When you have the increased permeability, what is going to happen? That's right, it's going to leak. We're going to leak fluid and blood and whatever else cells into that area, so you're going to have swelling. And when you have swelling in an area, and you've also got damage from whatever trauma that you had, that's going to damage those little sensors in there, and it's going to stimulate pain. Bradykinin and prostaglandins are being released too, and they help facilitate the pain process. And then the other one that's not on the slide that you can add is limited mobility of whatever area it is. Okay, so those were local manifestations. Make sure you know the difference between local and systemic. All right, so local manifestations, I told you the red, swelling, pain, warmth, and limited mobility. But we can also have systemic manifestations. Systemic usually is an indication of a bigger problem. You know, if I stick a thorn in my finger, I'm not going to have a fever from that. I'm just going to have those local signs. But if I get infected with a bacteria, I'm going to have bigger signs. I'm going to have fever. And so this is caused by both exogenous meaning that whatever's infected me is producing some sort of exotoxin that's causing the fever, or endogenous pyrogens. When we talk about endogenous pyrogens, we're talking about those interleukins, and we're also talking about the tumor necrosis factor. Those are the two things that help promote fever. Interleukins and the tumor necrosis factor. Interleukins and the tumor necrosis factor. All right, and then you'll learn later on how fever works. We have a normal set point. The hypothalamus is set our normal temperature. And so what happens in the presence of these pyrogens, our set point will be changed by the hypothalamus. And so you'll learn a little later on how that works. You can also have something called leukocytosis. When you talk about leukocytes, you see leuko, we're talking about white blood cells. And so leukocytosis means increased number of. Again, this means a bigger problem. You should not see that if you stick a thorn in your finger. You have some other issue going on. So you can see that in bigger infections, bigger problems. So the increased number of circulating leukocytes. All right, so again, it tells us both fever and leukocytosis are not specific. They simply tell us that there is a problem, and we have to look for specific symptoms that point us in the right direction. I've already mentioned C-reactive proteins. The rest of the stuff you don't have to worry about. Acute phase reactants, we do see C-reactive proteins elevate. Again, it is not specific. It doesn't tell us what type of inflammation. It just tells us that inflammation is present. All right, questions about the difference between local and systemic, fever, leukocytosis? Okay, then we want to talk about different types of basically drainage, exudative drainage that you can see associated with the inflammatory process anytime that you have an injury. And so there are ways to describe it, because one of the things that you're going to start learning is how to document the things that you see in your assessment. And so you want to be sure that you can explain the type of drainage, because it's really important. It tells us what's going on in that process based on the type of drainage that we're seeing. So serous exudate means that it's watery. We're seeing a lot of plasma in there. All right, that indicates early inflammation, and that makes sense, because that's the cells spread apart. We're going to start seeing an increased leaking of that fluid. The red blood cells are a little bit bigger, so sometimes you don't see them. You may see a little pink tinge, but for the most part, you're going to see the water. It's going to be a lot of that. Fibrinous exudate. Think of fibrinogen in the clotting system, and so that already tells you what we're going to see. We're going to see clots that exudate in there. You're going to see strands of fibrogen in there. And that's a little bit more advanced in terms of the inflammatory process. And the body's having some trouble dealing with that. And it could be a large injury too. Purulent. Okay, I'm going to say this, not on tape though. All right. So you're going to describe it as pus. This is what my family loved to make fun of me, and this is one thing they'll describe it incorrectly just to get a rise out of me. They do it all the time. Back to the point, I'm almost doing it now because I hear it all the time nowadays. Purulent exudate indicates there is a bacterial infection, and so we're seeing the byproducts of that bacterial infection. Talking about with phagocytosis is going to break that down, and you're going to have the dead part of it released. It's going to be the byproducts that are going to be left behind, and so that does indicate that we have a bacterial infection. And then if we have hemorrhagic exudate, that means that it is bright blood, it's bright red blood, and it's bleeding, and it's more involved in the inflammatory process. It could also indicate that there is a lot of increased permeability, which means that there's an overwhelming inflammatory process going on at that time. All right, chronic inflammation, you'll talk about this when you do wounds, but you'll talk about, well, wound healing. This gets into wound healing, but chronic inflammation, generally, I think I said 3 months, and that was wrong because that's pain. I'm thinking pain. Inflammation lasting 2 weeks or longer is chronic inflammation. So go back to the very first slide. If you wrote that down, take it off because I think it was the very first slide I said that. Inflammation lasts 2 weeks or longer. And basically what's happened is the inflammatory process started and for some reason it can't be resolved. Either it's a very large injury that's still going on, or there's something present in the wound that the body cannot get rid of. I think of tuberculosis as being one because it has that waxy outer area on the tuberculosis cell. It's hard for us to get rid of. And so the body will continually try to break that down. If it's something foreign, like shrapnel, the body can't get rid of that, but it's going to try to get rid of it. So you can see actually chronic inflammation develop. The problem with that is that so all these processes have gone on, and now it's going to change over to some more chronic type cells. It is damaging to the body, and it also, as I said, we recognize that chronic inflammation is a stress on the body and can lead to the development of chronic diseases. So we want to try to avoid chronic inflammation or suppress that inflammatory response. So it's inflammation lasting 2 weeks or longer. Something has happened so that you can't resolve the inflammatory response. And so these are the characteristics that you'll see. It's going to be different than what you see with the acute inflammatory response. You will not see neutrophils. The neutrophils are long gone. All right, so you're going to see different cells involved in this. So what you're going to see more of the later cells, which are going to be your lymphocytes that become the macrophages. The monocytes that become the macrophages, because it's going to be trying constantly to break that down. It's going to be trying to perform phagocytosis and get rid of it. Eventually what's going to happen is a granuloma is going to form, and that's when we encapsulate whatever it is that we can't get rid of, like we talked earlier about the tuberculosis. Epithelioid cells, that is a different type of cell that will develop. It actually becomes a giant cell, which is a larger cell, and it's the body's way of saying, okay, if my normal cells won't get rid of it, let me try a bigger cell and see if we can. And a lot of times it can't. If it's a piece of metal, it's not going to get rid of it. So a lot of times we have these granulomas that will form. And I've already mentioned causes of chronic inflammation. The high lipid or wax content, again, tuberculosis is the best example. There are some organisms that actually have the ability to, they can evade the granules and it doesn't break them down. And so they survive. And so they have the ability to survive inside the macrophage. And so isn't that a cruel joke right there? Some toxins, the body can't do anything with them. It could be that it's a foreign substance, a physical error, something that we can't get rid of. If you get a splinter, a wood splinter, the body really cannot break that down. Eventually it will work it to the top and hopefully get it out. Otherwise you're going to have a little granuloma form. All right, and this shows you chronic inflammation. Please make sure that you know the difference in terms of the cells that are present in chronic inflammation versus acute. Those neutrophils are gone. We're over here in chronic inflammation where we've got the lymphocytes and the monocytes that will become the macrophages. The first responders are long gone by now. Questions about chronic inflammation? And in terms of wound healing, I'm going to briefly mention that the first phase of wound healing is the inflammatory process. So they actually sort of ooze over into each other. The inflammatory process is really important. When you get phagocytosis going on, it's job is to get it cleaned up so that you can have healing take place. So that's why it is the first phase in the healing repair process. So his job is to clean it up and get ready for new cells to be put in there. And then what's going to happen is you're going to have, once it's cleaned out and ready to go, you're going to have proliferation of cells. We need to build that back up. We need to get cells to that area so that we can build that area and fill it back in. And so the job there is to return into tissue to the original structure and function, or as close. If it's a very small wound, then you may have good luck doing that. If it's a really large wound, maybe not so much. It just depends on the type of wound, but it's going to get it as close as we possibly can. And so these are the things that are going to take place. Filling in the wound, so you're going to build it back up. Sealing it over, that's your epithelialization, that outer layer of skin. And then it's going to shrink and contract and pull back together. And hopefully at that point it's going to become strong again. One thing I want to talk to you about was how we heal. We heal by either primary intention or secondary intention. Primary intention means that wounds didn't lose a lot of tissue loss. There's not a lot of tissue loss, and so they heal very easily, basically. A paper cut would be a great example of a primary intention. A paper cut simply is a slit. You didn't lose any tissue, you simply had it opened up, so it just goes back together and heals back up. It hurts a lot, but it'll eventually heal back up pretty easily. An incision, when they make that first incision, now they're not removing anything, they're making an incision. That incision is a straight line, we're not taking tissue out, and so we pull it back together and suture it up, and it should heal back together. That's primary intention. Secondary intention are wounds that have lost a lot of tissue. So this may be a gunshot wound, where a lot of tissue has been lost. It's open, and we're going to fill that back in. So it's going to take longer, it's going to take more work to heal that. And so that would be secondary intention. It is an open wound, you have more tissue loss. Can you have both going on at the same time? You could. That initial incision, they opened up, they take out a tumor. They're removing all that, removing the tissue around the tumor. All that's got to be filled in. So where they actually remove the tumor will be secondary intention, but that initial incision, that's primary intention. I won't trick you on the test. It'll be pretty straightforward. But just so you know, you can be doing both depending on what you're looking at in terms of healing. Okay, in terms of the reconstructive phase, this in your textbook to me is a little bit confusing. They don't do a really good job of it. So basically, I'm going to go back a slide. When I talked in here in the proliferation phase, this is really what you want to focus on for the exam. We're not going to cover this slide here because the textbook, every time I read it, it just doesn't get much better. So mark this off. And then remodeling, I'll mention this is when you have the scar tissue is going to be replaced. The tissue that has been destroyed is going to be replaced with scar tissue. And so scar tissue, I just want to mention scar tissue is made up of collagen. It doesn't have good blood flow to that area. There's not blood vessels, whereas when tissue heals, new blood vessels to be formed. But if you have scar tissue that forms, it does not have, initially it has some blood flow, and then that's going to retract, and it's just going to become an area that it is not going to be as strong as it was in that area. It is also going to not give. It's not flexible. All right? So that's really important, for example, if you have a heart attack and you end up having scar tissue on the heart. Well, the heart is constantly contracting and relaxing. Well, if you've got scar tissue in the area, that part of the heart muscle is not going to do that, and so it's going to be altered in terms of how the heart pumps and how much blood it can pump out. So that scar tissue becomes very important when you look at how it's going to affect function. All right, I had a video for this at one time. I'll see if I can find it. I don't know if I posted it or not. But this just shows you the acute inflammation that we talked about and takes you through the steps of how it heals and how the wound closes and how the scar tissue forms. And so I'll look and see if I have that video. That was a nice little video.
Do we need to know any steps of the maturation phase from the
Let
last
me go back. I think I went the wrong way. Just the scar tissue, how scar tissue forms.
Okay.
Was the only thing I'm going to mention there.
Okay.
All right, and this is really all we've already talked about. Here is the acute inflammation reconstruction phase starts. This is the reconstruction phase. We have collagen and then scar tissue developing. You can have some situations that occur where you have dysfunction during the inflammatory process, wound in terms of healing. You can have hemorrhage, which means you have too much blood being lost, and you can't heal in that situation. You're losing all the things that you need to heal. and so it's going to actually it's going to prevent healing from taking place until we get that bleeding under control. You can have fibrous adhesions. Adhesions can be a problem. The adhesions are, well, it's fibrous, meaning they don't give either. They're like scar tissue, honestly. They're more likely to happen in the bowel. You'll see them attached to the colon. And this is usually in somebody who's had abdominal surgery, had hysterectomies, had prior colon surgeries. We tend to see adhesions develop there. The problem is that with adhesions is they can actually wrap around the colon and cut off the blood supply. They can also block the colon so that stool cannot pass through, so you can become obstructed. We can go in there and do surgery and clean those out if we have to. We also don't know why some people develop adhesions and some don't. Some will develop them almost immediately after surgery. Some will develop adhesions for 20 years, and we don't know why that is. So it can really vary in terms of how they develop. Other dysfunctional processes, of course, you can develop an infection. Until that infection has gotten under control, that area is not going to heal because those macrophages are working really hard trying to do phagocytosis, and you're going to have all those byproducts of that, and it's not going to heal until we get that under control. And then you can have some problems with excess scar formation. I've got a couple pictures to show you of that. You can also have wound sepsis. Wound sepsis is a little bit, you can have localized infection. You can also have a larger wound sepsis. Sepsis means it's getting into the bloodstream. Hypovolemia means that it's low volume, so you're losing too much fluid. I have had patients that have had abdominal surgery. They were overweight, and so what happened was that the incision started to come apart, and they actually developed what's called a fistula. And a fistula is an open tract, and it was really just a drain. It was draining fluid out. She was losing so much fluid. We ended up having to take her back to surgery, so you can actually lose too much fluid and develop hypovolemia. You can lose a lot of proteins, and as you know, proteins are very essential in healing, and so if you're too permeable, we're just going to lose all those proteins. One of the best examples, burns. We lose a ton of proteins, and they lose a ton of fluid, and healing is very difficult. Other things that can affect healing, anti-inflammatories. Anti means against the inflammatory process, so it's actually going to suppress the inflammatory process. And remember, the first stage in healing is the inflammatory process. So if you don't have that, then healing is not going to take place like it should. One of the best examples is steroids. You can take, people think the illegal steroids, but we actually have steroids that we give you for certain diseases, such as COPD, to decrease the inflammation in the lungs. Some of your autoimmune disorders, like lupus, you may be on steroids for those. Well, the problem with that is if you get an injury, it's going to be more difficult to heal. This is where we had the problems with scarring that takes place, the keloid scar and the hypertrophic scar. And I've got pictures of those I'll show you in just a minute, I believe. Impaired epithelialization, again, your steroids. Epithelialization is the covering over the top layer, covering that back in. And so that won't take place if you're on steroids, if they're not getting good oxygen, or if they have nutritional deficits, then they're not going to be able to replace those cells. And then contractures means that when it healed, it pulled together too much. And the best example I can give you would be my great-grandmother. When she was a child, she fell into the fireplace, and she got burnt here. And what happened was that scar actually contracted, and so the fingers for her rest of her life were like this. And so she couldn't use her fingers because they were bent over like that. That's a contracture. It pulls it together, and you've lost mobility in that area. The scar became it pulled together too tightly and is restricting that motion. Now, there are things that we can do now. Back then, you couldn't do anything. If there is a problem with that, we can go in and try to clean up that scarring. All right, this is an example of dysfunctional wound healing. Hypertrophic scars basically are scars that stay in where the incision is, but they're raised and they're bumpy and big scars. And some people do this and some people don't. They are more prevalent in the African American population, but anybody can do it. I actually have this problem. I don't know why. My mother doesn't genetically. Nobody else has it, but we don't know what causes it, why people do it. Keloid scarring means that it gets outside the boundaries of the incision, so it's actually larger than the initial wound. And I guess that's all I have to say about that. And then finally, I want to mention wound dehiscence. Because there are times when you have a wound and that wound is healing, it is very fragile. And so if excessive stress is put on that wound, it can come apart. And that's what dehiscence is. It pulls apart. The wound pulls apart at the suture line. Usually it's from excessive strain or obesity. What I mean by excessive strain, an example would be if you had somebody that had abdominal surgery and they decide, sitting straight up in the bed is a But if you do that, you are clenching all these abdominal muscles and you may pull that incision line apart. So we teach you how to roll over on your side and gently get up so you don't pull those muscles. But that can happen in excessive strain and obesity. Adipose tissue, it's hard for the sutures to stay in there. It's hard for healing to take place, and it tends to want to come apart. So we have to be very careful in those situations. The problem with this is if it comes apart, we had a gentleman who had an abdominal incision, was overweight. He was walking, and it just blew apart. And so we had intestines coming out, so we had to get everything in to protect it. But we did not want wound sepsis from occurring. What will happen is anywhere it touches, it's going to pick up bacteria. And so go back to surgery really quick and put everything back where it needs to go and suture it back up with some different types of sutures is what we did. So you want to be careful that you teach your patients to avoid excessive strain. And if your patients are overweight, we need to be careful on what they're doing and how they're moving, so we're not pulling on that incision. We still want them to move. It's not an excuse not to move. We still want them up and moving. We just got to be careful on what we do. And the reason is because if we do have dehiscence, then we're going to have wound sepsis that's going to develop. All right, in pediatrics, this just shows you they do have, initially they don't have that immune response, that inflammatory response until everything catches up. And so you can read this slide here. One of their problems is because their immune system doesn't respond early on as they need to, they can develop overwhelming sepsis if they're exposed to something in utero or right after delivery. They can have overwhelming sepsis, and it's really hard to get them over that. As we age, there are some changes that can impact our ability to heal. Diabetes, which we'll learn about a little later on, can impair blood flow to an area because there's a buildup of plaque that is associated with diabetes. Also, there's some problem with nerves in there. So the wound just doesn't heal like it's supposed to. And then cardiovascular disease, the same thing. That's going to impact blood flow getting to areas so that they can heal. There is medications that can decrease the inflammatory process. I mentioned steroids. We can use those. There are some other medications you'll learn about. Is pharmacology next semester? I keep saying, is it? Okay. I keep saying next semester, forgetting that the early study. And then healing responses are diminished because the skin's loss of regenerative ability. Basically, we lose collagen as we age. And we need collagen. Collagen is a very important part of that basement membrane, the very first layer when those cells are starting to heal back in that area. So we lose those. Infections are more, I don't like the statement, infections are more common in the older adult. Need to be clear there. It's not that as you age you're going to get a lot of infections. It's that you have some of these other things that promote infections. And so we have to be very careful and make sure that we are monitoring for these things to occur. We have to be very proactive in this population. And then I just wanted to mention that there are diseases associated with inflammation. I've already mentioned atherosclerosis. We recognize that heart disease, the first step in heart disease is an inflammatory process. And also in chronic bronchitis and asthma is an inflammatory process as well. And then we're going to talk about an allergic reaction next week, and I'll go over that inflammatory process. Okay, questions about that? Okay, what time is it? Oh, I should have started the next section. Usually I have much more questions. Y'all so quiet there. Y'all tired? What is it? No questions, just tired, ready for the week to be over. Okay, because usually I have more questions and this takes longer. But